So last week we rounded off our series that we called Bringing It All Back Home with a puja, in which we, one of the things we did was talk about those things that we have, as it were, brought home into our lives in Sheffield in the 21st century from ancient teachings that were given a long way away, a very, very long time ago. And that puja marked the end of that series. So tonight's a sort of optional extra. It's a sort of optional extra, which is billed in our programme as a seasonal story. I wonder what it could be. What do you think? All right. It's Dickens' Christmas Carol. Hey. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge. Yes, we've done it before. I know we've done it I argued with the centre team. I said, we've done it before. And they said, no, please do it. And I always do what I'm told. So here I am, giving a talk on the Christmas Carol. Well, it's a bit sentimental, and it glorifies Christmas, which is a sort of consumerist extravaganza, and I think this might be the 6th time, certainly the last 3 years, maybe before that. I remember doing it when Vadanya was still here, so... But hey, it's a great story, and it's a very, very dharmic story. It's a very good story for illustrating some really important dharmic teachings. So the last time I gave this story, which was a year ago, I drew out how it illustrates very clearly Sangharakshita's 5 aspects of the spiritual path. So it's very, very clearly a story of a spiritual death and rebirth. So those 5 aspects are integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and then the 5th one, which actually has to exist in all of the others, is receptivity. And this is another piece of genius from the founder of our order, Sangharakshita. And it's very clearly an illustration of that, because it's very clearly a story of a spiritual death and a rebirth. And it's also very clear that this happens, this spiritual death and rebirth happens because of a process of integration of past experiences, in at least the way it's told in the book. I don't know about the films. And which gives birth to positive emotion, which causes this transformation. And because at the same time, one of the things that happens is that the character Scrooge moves from being very unreceptive and rejecting anything that's going to alter his present state to being very receptive. So it really, really clearly illustrates those 5 aspects that Sangharakshita brought out. And that's not a coincidence. That those 5 aspects are there in the story of Scrooge because, it's a story of spiritual change. And it's a story that was written by a great writer. And because he's a great writer, it's in a sense, it's a true story. It describes things, it's a bit exaggerated, but it describes something in it that's in accord with reality. All real spiritual growth will have those 5 aspects. So it's no coincidence. They're not some sort of intellectual theory that Sangharakshita thought up. They're a description. They're as much of a description of what happens to us when we change as a description of how plants change, as saying, well, first the roots grow and then the leaves grow, etc. It's a description. But the challenge for me, having given this story 6 times in a row, is, well, how do you bring out a different aspect to the Dharma from this story? How do you find a new Dharmic angle? Well, luckily that isn't that difficult, because it's a Dharmic story, you can find lots of angles. And even more luckily, one of the Dharma teachings that the story illustrates is really related to our next theme. Which is the 7 points of training the mind. They're a great audience. I just love being in Sheffield. So the 7 points of training the mind will be new to some of you. It will be new to some of you. But if you've been involved with Triratna a while, you may well have come across it because it's quite well known within Triratna. In fact, you could say it's become almost part of our tradition. We've adopted it. So the mind, if you haven't come across it before, or maybe if you have, I'll just say very briefly that it's a tradition that began in Indonesia before Buddhism was wiped out in Indonesia by Muslim invasions. It spread to India and then to Tibet, where it became hugely important in all Tibetan schools. And very briefly, leaving out an enormous amount, what it gives us, if I'm trying to sum it up in a sentence, is it gives us some very, very practical, very, very powerful teachings designed to change how we think about the difficult situations that we encounter in life. That in a way that allows us to use those difficult situations as part of our practice, rather than as things that get in the way of our practice. So it's particularly relevant if we live active, engaged lives in the world where we will come across difficult situations. If we see those as things that get in the way of our practice, most of our life will get in the way of our practice. We don't want to see our practice as something that just happens when we're on retreat or in easy situations. So there's more to it than that, and we'll be saying a lot more about it over the coming months, but that's probably enough for now. So at the very, very beginning of the most important mind training text, there's this line. It says, first train in the preliminaries. First train in the preliminaries. And in completely typical manner, it doesn't tell you what those are. But there's a sort of commentary tradition that goes with it. And the traditional commentaries tell us that these preliminaries are a set of reflections. They're a set of reflections which are sometimes called the four reminders, and they're sometimes called the four thoughts that turn the mind, or the four reflections that turn the mind, that make the mind suitable for Dharma practice. And we will be looking at these four reflections in more detail as well in a few weeks' time. But what I'd like to do tonight is just to describe them very, very briefly, and to bring out how the spiritual transformation that happens to Scrooge in this story, The Christmas Carol, how this transformation is actually brought about by him realising these four thoughts that turn the mind, by him really sort of imbibing the teachings that they give, how he became aware of these truths, which caused this process of spiritual death and rebirth that I've been talking about. And I'd also like to bring out one other connection between the Scrooge story and the mind training tradition, the 7 points of training the mind, that we'll be looking at in January. And this is about our response to dukkha, our response to discomfort, suffering, pain. Usually, dukkha, suffering, pain, whether it's physical or mental, it drives us into our shell. It cuts us off from others. We become concerned with ourselves. I think if you think about your experience of dukkha, of pain, physical or mental, I think you'll realise that what we generally do is we go into ourselves. We haven't got a lot of emotional energy or space for going out to others. And of course this only tends to make our suffering worse, actually, because to be shut up in ourselves is to suffer. And another thing that happens when we experience dukkha, when we experience suffering or discomfort, particularly maybe mental discomfort, is that we refuse to allow ourselves to feel it. So we refuse to allow ourselves to feel emotions, feelings like sorrow or sadness, because they aren't very pleasant. But when we repress one emotion in that way, we dull all our emotions. You can't have one without the other. So we don't experience warm, positive emotions either, like metta or joy. By refusing to feel the emotions we don't like, we also stop ourselves from experiencing positive emotions. So those two things about our response to dukkha. One is allowing it to cut us off from others, and the other is allowing our response to it to sort of dampen down our whole emotional tone because we don't want to feel. And as I say, the mind training tradition in particular brings out the idea of using our dukkha to connect us to others. And to do that, we have to, first of all, be aware of it. We have to allow ourselves to be aware of it. And I think we'll see that that comes in very clearly to this story. Yeah, and that's very important. That's very important because we will experience dukkha in our life. We will experience dukkha in our life. We all experience it. Sometimes just mild dissatisfaction, sometimes physical, mental suffering. So how we respond to dukkha is hugely important. How we respond to dukkha is hugely important. It's the key to using the situations of everyday life in a creative way to help our spiritual practice along, rather than to seeing it as a way that it hinders. So those are the Dharmic points that I'd really like to bring out of this seasonal story. The four reflections that change the mind. And secondly, how we respond to dukkha. How we respond to dukkha and how that we can either use that in a positive way or allow it to cut us off. So, our story. It starts with one Ebenezer Scrooge, a character whose very name has passed into our culture as the archetype, if you like, of meanness and nastiness in a way. And Scrooge is what we would call a successful businessman. He's a successful man in the terms in which our society measures success. He does well in his business. He's got a big house, and he's got plenty of money. And in fact, of course, what he's really famous for is being obsessed with money, very reluctant to give any of it away. Dickens describes him as squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous. Hard as sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck a generous fire. Secret, self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature always with him. He iced his office in the summer days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. So the metaphors that Dickens used to describe Scrooge are hard, like flint, trapped in himself, self-contained, so secret, self-contained and solitary as an oyster. Trapped in himself. And finally, cold. He thinks it's a virtue to be concerned. So he's self-contained. He thinks it's a virtue to be only concerned with himself and not to be concerned with others. In fact, he says to some people who come around collecting for the poor, it's enough for a man to understand his own business and not interfere with other people's. So that's his ethos. It's look after yourself. Everybody did that, would be fine. So he's trapped, he's cut off from others. He's the opposite of connected. So Dickens tells us nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? Will you come and see me? When are you going to come round?" But did Scrooge care? He edged his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. So, keep away from me, I want to be separate. Scrooge is also, he's very rational, materialistic and cynical. He only values what can be seen and measured. So when his nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas, he famously replies, they're a great audience. Bah humbug, he says, bah humbug, Merry Christmas. What reason have you got to be merry? You're poor enough. But his nephew actually is pretty sharp, because his nephew says, well, what reason have you got to be so dismal then? Because you're rich enough. So to me, Scrooge seems very in keeping with the spirit of our times in a way. The message we're bombarded with is that the way to be happy is to be rich, to have stuff. Having more money and stuff is the key to human well-being. But we don't seem to have noticed that we've already, at least in our culture, got enough stuff and enough money. And yet so many people live really unfulfilled lives that are dismal, like Scrooge. We have more depression and anxiety and mental illness than ever before. We don't seem to have noticed that. Anyway, so although it's Christmas Eve, and it should be the season of goodwill, Scrooge he starts out by being thoroughly nasty to his nephew, with the bar humbug episode and more. And then he refuses his nephew's invitation to come round for Christmas dinner. And then he's thoroughly nasty to his poor put-upon clerk, Bob Cratchit. And then he's thoroughly nasty to some charity collectors who come around collecting money for the poor. He says to them, "What, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And if some do die, well, that will reduce the surplus population." So he's all reason, no human empathy, no positive emotion. And then, as a very cold, foggy, frosty Christmas Eve night falls, he makes his way home from his office through the gathering gloom. It's just about dark when he gets home. And in the gloom, something sort of erupts from the depths into his conscious mind. He doesn't want it, it's very unwelcome, but it starts to impinge on his limited consciousness that he finds safe and comfortable. So in the gloom, he reaches for the doorknob. He reaches for his doorknob, but instead of his usual doorknob, he sees the head of his old business partner, Jacob Marley, who has been dead these past 6 years. So he recoils in shock and horror. But then he reminds himself that he is a down-to-earth rationalist. He says, and he collects himself together and he opens the door. And then he locks the door. It's like this big door, slam, locks, thinking this will keep out whatever it is that's troubling him. But then he gets into his hallway of his big house, his big, dark, empty, gloomy house, and he sees a hearse with a coffin going up the wide stairs. And then he gets into his big, dark, gloomy living room, and he sees his ornate fireplace, which is carved with figures, and he sees that each figure has the head, the face of his dead partner, Jacob Marley. Then a bell starts to toll, and he hears the clanking of chains, and so someone is dragging them across the floor. And Jacob Marley. Jacob Marley's ghost. Jacob Marley's ghost. It's unintentional. Jacob Marley's ghost appears to him, looking very miserable and all wrapped around with chains. So this is the first bit of wisdom that's erupting into Scrooge's mind. It has to do with death. He sees a hearse and the ghost of his old partner. He sees the ghost of his old partner who's died. He's probably the same age as him, everywhere. His head is everywhere. It's something he doesn't want to think about, but it's a fact. We will all die. This is a reality. And some of this wisdom about the actual nature of reality has erupted from the depths into Scrooge's mind. And in the light of this reality, all of Scrooge's wealth and material success and all the money that he hoards starts to look completely meaningless. None of that gives him any protection. He doesn't want to know this. So this truth thrusts itself upon Scrooge, something that he should have reflected upon, perhaps, which would have turned his mind and caused him to live a different life. And this is one of the mind-turning reflections that I talked about earlier. Oops, not that one. But that one, the inevitability of death. That is one of our 4 mind-turning reflections, which, if we really take it on board, will have a big influence on the way we live. But Scrooge, he tries to protect himself from this realisation with his old defence of cynical scepticism. So he tries to make a joke out of it. That's what we often do, isn't it? We try and make a joke out of it. He says that this vision, it looks like nothing, this vision of Jacob Marley is nothing more than the result of a bad dinner. He says that Marley's ghost smells more of gravy than of the grave. But whatever it is that's appearing to Scrooge as Jacob Marley's ghost is not going to be put off. So he tells Scrooge, the ghost tells Scrooge, that the reason he is wrapped up in chains is because of his self-centered life, in which he didn't care about anyone himself, so he is doomed to wander in chains. And he says that the chains are of his own making. He made them link by the mean and selfish way he lived his life. And now he has to drag them around. He says, I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Would you like to know, he says, the weight and length of the chain that you bear yourself? It was just as heavy and long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago when I died. And you have been working to make it even heavier ever since. By now it is a very heavy, ponderous chain. So he says that Scrooge has spent a long time making just the same sort of chain as himself. And he warns him that unless he changes his life, he will face the same horrible fate, doomed to wander around as an unhappy spirit with this dragging the chains he has created by his actions, forever doomed to regret for having wasted his life. So, Marley's ghost tells Scrooge about karma. He tells him about the reality of the law of karma. That if we act unskillfully, we create fetters and chains for ourselves that we have to carry around. We make them link by the way we live our life. We create these deep habits that we cease to be in control of by the way we live our life. They're like chains. By every one of our actions. Whereas if we act skillfully in a way that connects us to others, we gradually weaken and dissolve the fetters that bind us. We become more free. So Jacob Marley's ghost tells Scrooge about the reality of the law of karma and says that he's come to warn him that he must start living differently. And of course, that's another one of our reflections that turn the mind. The reality of karma. Accepting that the law of karma is an absolute reality. It's not some Buddhist theory. We can see it in action. We can see it in other people. We can see how the way they live has created the person they are and how that creates their experience of the world. And some of that can be very dark or it can be very light. The reality of law of karma. And as part of the reality of accepting the reality of the law of karma, I mean, we see that it's not how much money we have or how many possessions we have, which will determine how happy we're going to be in the future. Or how much we will suffer in the future. It's the skillfulness or unskillfulness of the way we live which will determine whether we are happy and fulfilled in the future, whether we have protection. We have plenty of money. Having plenty of money and a big house and a big lockable door can't make us secure. But what can make us secure from future suffering is a good life, a skillful life. So Jacob Marley's ghost forces Scrooge's conscious mind, if you like, firstly to face the truth of death, his inevitable death, and which he'd rather forget, and then he shows him the reality of the law of karma, two of our mind-turning reflections. And then he says that Scrooge is going to see three more spirits in the course of the night. But completely in character, for someone who is all reason and out of touch with his emotions, Scrooge says, well, you've already warned me. Can't we do without the three spirits? I know what you're saying. I don't need to. I know that. I know I'm going to die. I know, I'm the heir of my actions. Why do I need these three spirits? That's enough. Knowing is enough. But Marley's ghost told him it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that, actually. There won't be any real change unless Scrooge experiences the emotions that the three spirits are going to lead him to experience. He might know about death and the law of karma. He might know that he needs to change or he will suffer, but that change has to happen in the depths of his being. And that's what the three ghosts are going to bring about. He has to be moved in his whole being. It's not enough just to know intellectually. And it's just like we're just like that with these four reminders. I'll talk about the other two later, but with these four reminders, the four reflections that turn the mind. I mean, we all know the inevitability of death rationally, but that doesn't stop us living, filling our life with distractions, pursuing all sorts of things that aren't of the first importance, fretting and worrying about things that don't really matter, which we wouldn't do if we really knew that we were going to die and had limited time. We may all know about the law of karma. We may accept that intellectually. But that doesn't stop us, when push comes to shove and we're experiencing dukkha, that doesn't stop us from seeking distractions and passing pleasures as our way to happiness, rather than thinking, well, actually the thing to do is just be aware of dukkha, face dukkha, and act skillfully. So we may know these things, but at some level, still they have very little impact on us. And that's what the three ghosts are doing with Scrooge. They're pushing that impact deeper. Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not saying that things like distractions and pleasures are bad, or wealth or any of those things. It's just that if we really accept the law of karma, they wouldn't be our top priority. Our top priority for our own future happiness would always be to act skillfully, whether it brought those things or not. Not in a way that feels good or distracts us from our boredom or discomfort. So the four reflections that we're going to talk about later, and I'll briefly mention tonight, they're not meant to be ideas that we accept intellectually. They need to sink into the depths of our being. We need to soak ourselves in them and let them really affect us. Know them in our bones. They need to have some emotional bite. Which maybe we can get by sort of thinking of how they connect with our experience, really using our imagination. But sometimes it takes a painful or even a shattering experience to bring home truths, like the truths of the four reminders. And this is sort of what happens to Scrooge, really, in the story. So in the course of the night, these three different ghosts that Jacob Marley predicted, they appear to Scrooge. They appear to him as he tries to get to sleep in his big, dark, gloomy house. Gloomy, lonely house. And the first one that appears at 1 a.m. is the ghost of Christmas past. The ghost of Christmas past. And this ghost wants to show Scrooge some things from the past. But Scrooge doesn't want to know. Scrooge doesn't want to know. It's things from Scrooge's own past. Scrooge does not want to know about them. His past has been painful, and he doesn't want to experience the dukkha that, remember, it would bring. But in the end, the ghost sort of drags him against his will on a journey. And he carries him out into the night, over London, and then over the surrounding countryside, until he gets to a landscape that Scrooge remembers from being a boy, remembers from his childhood. And there he sees himself back in the past, far away, as a miserable young boy, poor and lonely and sad and neglected, sitting reading by himself. Scrooge obviously had a terrible, sad, friendless, lonely childhood. And at some level, he is still that child. At some level, he's still that child. He's still a sad and lonely person. But the last thing he wants is to be aware of that. The last thing he wants is to be aware of that. Sadness and loneliness are not, and sorrow are not emotions that he will allow himself to feel. Until now, he's thrust them down. He's thrust them down out of consciousness, refused to own up to them. And the ghost had to drag him unwillingly to see his own sadness. Scrooge, in fact, is a deeply unhappy man. And the dukkha he experiences is what cuts him off from others, as dukkha often does. It causes him to focus on just himself, to protect himself, to keep himself separate from others. And he refuses to experience this dukkha, so that his positive emotions are frozen out. And this is why Dickens tells us that Scrooge is secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. He is cut off by his dukkha. And it's why Dickens can tell us that the cold within him froze his features and nipped his pointed nose and shriveled his cheek, etc. He will not allow himself to experience his painful feelings, so he doesn't experience any of his feelings, his warm feelings either. To keep his sadness away, he froze his emotion. But as we've seen, the ghost dragged him to an awareness of his childhood, an awareness of the sadness and loneliness and sense of alienation from other people, which is actually driving him still. It's driving him still. And this releases a flood of positive emotion. Just realizing his own sadness, seeing himself as a child, releases this flood of positive emotion. So he feels compassion for the suffering of his younger self. And this immediately turns into compassion for other children like the child he was. So he gets an uprush of regret for having turned away a child just like himself from his door who came begging for some food. So his dukkha, when he allows it to happen, it connects him to others. It connects him to others, rather than cutting him off. He sees that I suffer and others suffer. And that shared suffering acts as a sort of connection, to others. And as I've said, this is also an important point in the mind training tradition that we're going to be looking at after Christmas in January. That our suffering can actually, if we use it properly, it can connect us to others. Because we can expand our compassion out to include others who experience exactly the same sort of sufferings that we do. So he's also shown his sister. He's shown in his childhood experience, he's shown his sister who died as a young adult. Again, more sadness. A sister who died re-experiences the sadness that he felt at her death. And this releases all sorts of fond feelings for her love that he had frozen out because he didn't want to experience the sadness. And then he's shown himself in his first job with his close friend at the time, Dick. He actually had a friend at the time. And his very kind employer, Dickens is great with names, Mr. Fezziwig. And he remembers the kindness of his employer, and he feels this strong uprush of gratitude. So, again, more positive emotion rushing up because he's allowed himself to feel. So he lets this awareness of the suffering he experienced as a child, which is pushed down out of awareness, he lets that come into the light of consciousness, and he finds it opens the door to empathy for others, compassion for others, compassion for the suffering of others. And when he opens that door, other emotions come too, like gratitude, metta and gratitude. So that's the teaching, if you like, of the ghost of Christmas past. We need to experience our suffering, and rather than allow it to cut us off from others and make us just focus on ourselves, by realising that that suffering is shared with others, allow it to connect us to others. Then that ghost vanishes. But there's been a change. There's been a big change in Scrooge already. So when the next ghost appears, the ghost of Christmas present, Scrooge is open to it. He's open to what it has to show. He says, if you have anything to teach me, let me profit by it, which is very different from his attitude to the first ghost. And what this ghost birth basically shows Scrooge is other people enjoying Christmas. Well, actually, what he shows him is other people enjoying their warm relationships. Their warm, close relationships, their connectedness with each other. And he shows him, the ghost shows him especially people that Scrooge thinks he's better than. So Scrooge thinks he's better than others because he's got more money than others. And what the ghost shows him is people who are poorer than him, who he thinks he's better than, actually being really happy because of their close relationships. So he shows him his poor nephew that he'd said bar humbug to, with his friends and his fiancée. And he shows him the warm atmosphere that they're creating among themselves. And he shows him his poor, unprepossessing clerk, Bob Cratchit, who turns out to be not so poor after all, because he has a much richer life than Scrooge, because he's loved and he loves. And hardest to take of all, he has shown himself as he looks in other people's eyes. So he thinks he's better than other people. But he sees that other people, far from thinking that he's better than they are, because of his wealth, they actually feel sorry for him. They feel sorry for him because of the way he's cut off from human relationships and from positive emotions like joy and metta. And that's a pretty big dose of self-knowledge for Scrooge. So what he sees, in a way, is that his whole approach to life has been a failure. He has been trying to get happiness. We all try to get happiness, but he's been trying to get happiness by having more money than others, and through the status that he feels that gives him and the respect he feels that gives him. And in fact, everybody knows that he is just deeply unhappy, and they, far from respecting him and for his supposed status, they pity him. So people feel sorry for him. The way he just has to realise that the way he has been seeking happiness in this life just has not worked. The way he's been seeking happiness has not worked. And this brings to the third of our four reflections, which is traditionally put in terms of, the traditional wording is no happiness in samsara. And I think that needs a bit of expansion. It's not saying there's no happiness to be achieved in this world. Samsara is really an approach to life. Samsara is an approach to life, not a place. So it's an approach to life by, as it were, depending on outer things to get our happiness, particularly depending on, outer things and things like respect and so on. That's our usual approach to happiness, to grab what we want, push away what we don't want. So no happiness in samsara we could translate as meaning that our normal ways of seeking happiness, by seeking money and possessions, by seeking distractions and entertainments, pleasures, by getting success and approval of others, that there's nothing wrong with any one of those, but as a strategy for getting happiness, they don't work. If that's the way we're going to seek happiness, it's not going to work, because we'll always get the opposite side of the coin. Because even if we got all of them, there would be something deeply, deeply missing. So no happiness in samsara we could translate as meaning the ways that we usually seek to find happiness simply are not going to work in the long term. They might distract us for a bit, but they're not going to work. Could reframe it simply as no happiness in external things, I suppose. We could sort of hark back to the introductory course and the story of the Buddha and the king, that, well, happiness is going to come from inside. It's not going to come from out of things. So Scrooge has built his life around seeking happiness from wealth and status, and all he has got from life is misery, which he didn't want to know. So he says to himself, having realised this, avarice, hard-dealing, griping cares, they have brought me to a rich end truly. It's quite a sad story, actually, so far. And then finally, in the last watch of the night, the third spirit appears to Scrooge, the ghost of Christmas yet to be. And he sees his own death and the legacy he leaves behind him. He sees the important businessman who he thinks are his peers and the people whose respect he wants, and he sees that what they really think of them. And one of them says it will be a very cheap funeral because nobody will go. Another one jokes that he will go for the free lunch. So he sees that he has no friends. He has no friends in the world and no respect in the world either. There's nobody who regrets his death. And all his possessions go to other people. And he sees himself dying alone and miserable. And then he's shown the future after his death. Someone else is in his chair in the office. Everything carries on as it might have done, as it did before. The only sign of he ever existed is an overgrown gravestone that nobody can be bothered to look after. And then, as the morning dawns, the ghost of Christmas yet to be sort of morphs into his bedpost. He thought he died. He'd seen this and he thought he died. He really thought he was dead. And then he's back in his bedroom and he realises he's alive. So he's just immensely relieved. It seems to him he's had a reprieve. He's been given an amazing opportunity. Old as he is, he realises that he still has the chance to do something positive in the world, have a positive impact. And this is the fourth and last of our reflections, our four reflections that turn to mind this precious opportunity. So he actually realises the preciousness of his opportunity, and that is totally transformative for him. Simply to be human and have reasonable health and opportunity is a precious opportunity, which is amazing. We mustn't waste it. So seeing this, Scrooge says, I am light as a feather. I'm happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there. Whoop. Hello. I don't know what month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello. Whoop. So he's like a baby. He's being reborn. He sends a turkey to Bob Cratchit's house by taxi. He gives a large sum of money to the charity collectors he'd refused. He goes to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner and has a thoroughly good time. And what Dickens said is he becomes as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the old city knew or any other city. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened in this globe for good at which some people did not laugh. And knowing that such of these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes in grins as have the malady in less attractive forms. So, I hope you enjoyed our seasonal story. It's a bit exaggerated, but it's a story with a pretty profound spiritual significance, I think. And it's a story of a transformation that happened because at a deep level, the hero of the story realised the truth of the four reminders, and he, because he accepted his dukkha and allowed it to connect him to others rather than separate him from others. So, in their traditional order, our four reminders or reflections are this precious opportunity, the inevitability of death, no happiness in samsara, and the reality of karma. And you read them at first, you might think, that's a bit miserable. But it wasn't miserable for Scrooge, was it? It was totally transformative for Scrooge because it booted him out of a way of being which was thoroughly unsatisfactory. So, yeah, I mean, there you go. So, we're going into the holiday period. You might want to reflect on these. We have a precious opportunity. And we have a precious opportunity. So some of us might find Christmas not the easiest of times. One of the things I'd suggest is we could all just reflect on these. We're going to say more about them in a few weeks' time, but we could, you could build these in a bit. But you could also reflect, well, how can I use this coming holiday period, which in some ways I might not be, it might be all right, but how can I use it to connect with others? How can I use it to connect with others rather than become cut off from others? You might want to think about that. And you might also want to talk about that in any groups. So, thank you. That's our Christmas story, I think. Have I got anywhere further to say? Yes, I have. So, anyway, reflecting on these, we all know them intellectually. We may not be starting from such a terrible point as Scrooge, but if we really knew them, we would have the same sort of transformation as he did. They would be just as transformative. And we might just give some thought to how we handle dukkha. Dissatisfaction, suffering, even pain. Does it separate us, cut us off from others? Or could we use it to actually connect with others? And if we want to do more of the latter, if you want to use your dukkha to connect more to others, start coming in January to the series on the 7 points of training. Thank you.